In this video, I'm going to show you how to analyze a company's gross margin percentage. I'm going to show you some reasons the gross margin percentage would go up or go down, and then I'm going to show you some examples of actual companies. But first, I want to make sure that you remember how to calculate the gross margin percentage. So here's the formula. You take a company's net sales and you subtract its cost of goods sold. This gives you, right here in the numerator, the company's gross profit. You take that gross profit, you divide it by the company's net sales, and then this number that you get here from this fraction, you then multiply by 100. So, if you have a company that sells a product for $100 and the product costs that company $80, they'd have gross profit of $20. Divide that by sales of 100, it's 0.2. Multiply it by 100, and you get 20%. So, that's how the gross margin percentage is calculated. It's basically showing you the markup that the company gets over the cost of its product when it sells it. Now, when you're analyzing the gross margin percentage, you want to focus on two things for the company. You want to look at the trend over time. Has the gross margin percentage been going up over time? Has it been going down? Was there a sudden increase or decrease? And you also want to compare the gross margin percentage across firms. So you'll look at peer companies, that same industry, they're competing with this firm, and look at what's going on with their gross margin percentage. Okay, so we're going to look at the trend going up or down. And remember also, it can be revenue driven or cost driven when there are changes in the gross margin percentage. And I'll talk about that with our examples. Revenue driven because we've got sales here, and cost driven because we have cost of goods sold. Now, I'm not going to do comparison across firms. I've got some other videos where I did that, and I'll probably do another video where I just specifically show you how examples of comparing the gross margin percentage across companies. Here, I'm just going to focus on trends over time and identifying whether they're revenue-driven, cost-driven, showing you for actual companies how to identify what's going on, what's up with the trend for the company's gross margin percentage. First, I want to mention a few common situations. Number one, you'll notice, and you'll see with some of the examples, as a company is growing, so when the company is in its growth phase, we think about the life cycle of the company, the gross margin percentage is typically going to be increasing. Now, why is that the case? The company might be getting better at making the product if it's a manufacturer, so there's a learning curve. If you were thinking about, let's say you got into knitting and you were knitting blankets, the very first few blankets that you made, it might take you a long time to make them because you're still learning, but as you make more and more, you get better and better at making the blankets. So there's a learning curve. So as they make more and more product, if the company's a manufacturer, they're going to get better at making the product. They're going to become more efficient. So that's one reason that the gross margin percentage might cut. You basically have like cost savings as they get better and more efficient at making the product. Also, thinking again about manufacturers, with absorption costing, which is used for GAAP when you think of generally accepted accounting principles, calculating cost of goods sold, fixed manufacturing costs are going to, per unit, they're going to come down and result in a lower cost of goods sold the more that the company manufactures product. In other words, the more units they make, the lower the fixed cost per unit, which will result in a lower cost of goods sold every time they sell products. So as the company grows and sells more products, they're going to be manufacturing more products, spreading the fixed costs over a greater number of units. Also, if we think about the distribution center, right? Because there's some distribution costs that are involved in cost of goods sold. It's not just the cost of manufacturing the product, right? There's also some transportation costs involved. And we're going to improve the efficiency of the distribution center system as the company gets larger. And then as the company makes larger purchase orders, which happens as the company grows, it gets bigger, it's buying more material from suppliers. So as it buys more material from suppliers, larger purchase orders, it can get volume discounts. So those are some reasons that you'll see when I show you a couple examples where the company's getting bigger and you see the gross margin percentage getting bigger, those are some reasons why. Now, you can sometimes have just a sudden decline. Maybe the gross margin percentage was going up and then suddenly it drops off. And you say, well, what's going on? Could be some macroeconomic factors like the recession going on, or it could be that there's increased competition. Maybe this company initially didn't have many competitors and now competitors saw how profitable it was. They're coming in and competing. How would this affect the gross margin percentage? Well, this could lead to some revenue-driven changes in the gross margin percentage because now there's going to be pressure to cut prices. So if the cost of the product remains the same, but the price comes down, that's going to squeeze the gross margin percentage, right? So gross margin percentage is going to get narrower. So if the company has to cut prices because now there's all these competitors, we're going to have to reduce price to sell this product, the margins are going to get smaller. Also, so if we have a recession or we have more competition, things like this, cost advantages can be lost. Why? If you think, okay, let's say there's a recession and so there's not as many consumers demanding a product, the company is going to be buying less material, right, to make inventory, because if they're selling less inventory, they're not going to need as much. And so they're going to have smaller purchase orders. And so that means they're not going to get the same kind of volume discounts they got when the company was growing, everything was going great, and so on. Now, when the company is in its decline phase, again, when we think about the life cycle of a company, when it's growing, then it matures, and at some point it starts to decline. You're going to see the decline in the gross margin percentage. The gross margin percentage is going to be going down as the company is in its decline phase, and you'll see an example of that in a minute. So we're going to have inventory write-offs. They have clearance sales. Maybe they're a retailer. They're closing some stores. And whatever cost advantages they had when they were growing and getting larger, those cost advantages are going to disappear. So those are some common situations you'll see. Now, I've got a list here. It's not an exhaustive list, but this is just some reasons that you might see a decrease in the gross margin percentage. And I've already mentioned a few of these things. We talk about price cuts. These are revenue-driven, decreases in the gross margin percentage. This is a revenue problem where they're having to cut prices because maybe there's more competitors or some of the inventory is just not moving quickly. Maybe they came up with a new product that the customers didn't really like or something like that. And then we think about, okay, if the prices of inputs, the price of raw materials is increasing and they can't increase their prices to pass that on to customers, that's going to squeeze the gross margin percentage. Higher transportation costs, even labor costs. Most people think, okay, well, labor costs are an SG&A expense, so it's not going to affect gross margin percentage. But there are some labor costs for some companies and cost of goods sold. When we think about the costs of handling the product and stuff, in some cases, those costs, some labor costs can be in cost of goods sold. Also for manufacturing, direct labor costs and so forth. So you can have some labor costs in cost of goods sold. Shrinkage, when we think about theft of the product, product being damaged, things like that, manufacturing costs, and so on. So how do you know? If you're looking at a company, how do you know when you see the gross margin percentage going down, how do you know which one of these it might be? Well, what you can do, if this is a publicly traded company, so if it's a public company in the U.S., so you can go, so public companies in the U.S. have to put out an annual filing, the 10K, and in that 10K, you'll see things like the financial statements and then the notes to the financial statements, but there's also this really helpful thing that people call MD&A, Management Discussion and Analysis. See that right there, item 7? Okay, this is from the table of contents of a 10K. If you go to the MD&A, it will often tell you, hey, here's why there was an increase or decrease in the company's gross margin percentage. So what I did was I went and did that for 4 different companies. I went and collected data and then went and read the MD&A to see, okay, why was it that the gross margin percentage went up or down? And we're going to start with the company Bed Bath & Beyond. I collected data from 2011 to 2022. And so we've got the gross margin percentage. It was actually very high for a retailer back in 2011 at 41.4%. And then you see it went down every single year except 2020 when we had the pandemic. So other than that, is basically just a decrease every single year in the gross margin percentage. So what happened? Well, they had increased competition. Increased competition led to price cuts. So this was a revenue-driven decline in the gross margin percentage over time. There were a few years where they said like, oh, okay, now we're doing more online orders, so there was an increase in shipping costs. But pretty much every single year, when I look at the MD&A, what it would say is an increase in coupons, an increase in redemption coupons, the average redemption amount. They were sending out more and more coupons trying to get people to buy their products. So they're just doing more and more price cuts because of the competition they faced. So you see that the price cuts, if the cost of the product remains constant, but the price goes down, that's going to squeeze those margins. And you see at the very end, we end up, it's almost cut in half. Now, the last couple of years is where it really got ugly. And then you start seeing the MD&A, they're talking about inventory write-downs. Remember, if a company believes that an inventory is on the balance sheet for an amount less than what it can get for that inventory, it's going to have to write down the inventory. Clearance sales, as they started closing some of their stores, and they have to just get rid of all the inventory at that store. So it really got ugly there. But all these years here, it was talking in the MD&A about price cuts, and you can see that trend over time. You don't want to see that. This is a company in its decline phase, as I was talking about earlier. So that was the gross margin percentage for Bed Bath & Beyond. Now, the company Blue Apron, which makes meal kits. So you see, back to 2014, which was the earliest data I could get, very low gross margin, but it was increasing. They had a little blip here, where it went down, but then increased and increased. So it went from 7% to 38.6%. So this was generally a really good trend that was going on for Blue Apron. And then here we see it start to decline. So I went for those years, and actually Blue Apron gave very good disclosures. And so this was a cost-driven decline when we focus on these years here. So they actually did this because if we see, look, from here to here, that's a 2.8 percentage point increase in cost of goods sold as a percentage of sales, or I should say, well, we're focused on the gross margin percentage, decrease. So I'll put this is a decrease in gross margin percentage of 2.8 percentage points. And they give you a breakdown. They said, look, 1.9 percentage points of that decrease from here to here was due to an increase in food and packaging costs. And then 0.6 percentage points was an increase in shipping costs. 0.3 was an increase in labor costs. So they broke it out for you. It was really helpful. And you see the majority was food and packaging costs went up, and that's why the gross margin percentage declined there. So generally positive trend for Blue Apron for several years there. It was getting better and better, and then you had the drop off. So next company we're going to look at, Carvana. Man, if you own stock in Carvana, it went on a wild ride. That company stock significantly went up, then significantly went down, and now is back up. And so you see 2014, Carvana actually had a negative gross margin, meaning that they're selling, at that point, they're selling the products for less than their cost. But became positive in 2015. It was getting better and better. Very good trend until 2022. What happened in 2022? Fed is jacking up interest rates in an effort to tame inflation. Higher interest rates means decreased demand, right? Higher interest rates, people are not getting as many car loans, not buying cars. So higher interest rates, decreased demand for vehicles led to Carvana doing price cuts. Price cuts to try and get rid of some of the vehicles. So price cuts, talk about revenue-driven change, right, in the gross margin percentage. So we can see here that decrease where we went from 15% to 9%. It was a decrease in demand led to price cuts. This was really a revenue-driven situation with the decline. But then the comeback was both revenue and cost-driven. In that, they tell you in the MD&A they did fewer price cuts. That was one reason the gross margin percentage was higher in 2023 and 2024. Fewer price cuts compared to 2022, and decreased costs of acquiring vehicles, reconditioning them, transporting them. So basically this comeback here, which I would say 2023 and 2024 was a comeback story for Carvana, both revenue and cost driven. Didn't have to do the price cuts they had to do in 2022, and costs were coming down. So that's why we explained this bad year here. Interest rates went up, demand went down, had to do price cuts, squeeze margins. But then when we get to the next couple of years, 2023 and 2024, didn't have to do the price cuts. Costs were coming down. Good thing for Carvana. Gross margin percentage starts going up again. Final company we want to look at, Beyond Meat. Beyond Meat was a little bit all over the place. Now you see that 2016, negative 39% gross margin percentage. So it was ugly. So they're selling the product for a lot less than what it cost them. 2017 was also negative, but not as bad. Finally, it got positive. 2018, then 2019, 33.5%. So a significant increase in trend over that time, but then the trend reverses. The trend reverses and starts going the other way and they end up getting the negative gross margin percentage again. So you have, as the company is growing, which we said usually as they're growing, they're in that growth phase, the gross margin percentage is getting better, but then it started declining and going the other way. And I looked at the MD&A, it was both revenue and cost driven. Number one, they had to do price cuts. Why? More competition, right, for these faux meat alternatives. So more competition led to them cutting price. Also, they had to write off a lot of inventory. They even had some equipment and stuff that was used in the handling process ended up getting written off and going through COGS. Increased costs of manufacturing, materials, logistics. So you had price cuts. So you got the price that you're getting for the materials going down. At the same time, costs are going up. So that's really going to squeeze margins. And that's why you see here the negative gross margin percentage. Now, 2024, the good news for them, finally it got positive again. But when I went to MD&A, it said, look, this was really because we just didn't have all the write-downs that we had the previous couple of years, and that's why it finally got positive. But you see, what still wasn't back to where it had been, in 2019 and 2020, where it was in the 30s, and they still hadn't got it back to that point in 2024. So it's been a wild ride for Beyond Meat. But again, you go to the MD&A, and it tells you the story behind this. And so, okay, we can tell, all right, look, as the company's growing larger, the gross margin percentage is getting higher. They're getting better at manufacturing the product. There's that learning curve, right? They're making more of it. But then at some point, we had increased competition. They're not selling as much, right? There were some other things like they talked about during the pandemic. They don't just sell to grocery stores. They also sell to restaurants. Restaurants were closed down. That was a process. They had a number of things going on. But you saw the price cuts and the increased costs squeezing those margins and it really getting ugly for Beyond Meat. So again, you want to look at the trend of the gross margin percentage over time and understand, okay, are any changes, are they revenue driven? Are they cost driven? And that can help you as you're understanding that company's performance. And then next step, trying to predict what's going to happen going forward.